Hey, Michael Brown here. You know, there's all these great AI tools these days for answering questions about different topics, and I'm sure a lot of people that are starting out with Lenticular think, hey, AI, how do I make a lenticular print? And they probably go to different AI systems like Claude or Perplexity or ChatGPT to find answers. Well, sometimes those answers are right, other times they're wrong, because it's just gleaning all sorts of information from the internet, some of which are facts, some of which are opinions. So I thought, as a simple test, I'm going to ask an AI some lenticular questions and see what it has to say. So here I'm running Claude via the internet, and I made a Word document with a few questions. So the first one is, how many frames should I use for a lenticular print? I think that would be a common beginner question. So we'll put that in and see what it has to say. The number of frames depends on the effect you want and the LPI of your lens sheet. Flips should have 2 images for simple, sharp results. I agree with that. Morph and transition, 3 to 6 frames work well. Not in my experience. I think you probably need more frames for good morph. Animation, 6 to 30 frames, depending on the smoothness desired. Probably a fair answer for my own personal work. I've gone much higher, 100 to 300 frames. And then zoom depth 3D, 5 to 15 layers or frames. So it really doesn't, that wouldn't help a beginner because layers are different than frames, but that's its answer. So not exactly that helpful. Then the finer the lens, the more frames you can pack in. Rough guide. This is completely backwards and wrong. LPI 10 to 15 recommended 2 to 4 frames. LPI 75 plus 6 to 20 frames. Somehow it thinks the finer the LPI, the more frames you can put in. That is completely wrong. The lower the LPI, the more frames you can use. So let's see. Key rule of thumb. More frames is smoother animation, but less sharpness per frame, since each frame gets a narrow slice of the lens. Probably a fair statement. Start conservative, 4 to 6 frames if you're new to it. You can always test before a full print run. 4 to 6 frames for what? If we're talking about a 2-phase flip, 4 to 6 is more. If we're talking about, a 3D print, probably 4 to 6 is too few. So probably bad advice with this particular question. Okay, of course, you're getting my opinions as a guy who's been doing this for 20 plus years. Now, the next one is actually kind of a tricky one. I don't know if we can expect it to know much. How do I use my camera to make a series of frames for a 3D lenticular? Let's see what it has to say. For 3D lenticular, capturing parallax, that's correct. Horizontal shifts in perspective to simulate depth, that's right. Set up your subject and move your camera sideways, left to right between shots, keeping the same height and distance. This mimics how your two eyes see slightly different angles. Do not rotate the camera. Translate it in a straight time. Good beginner advice. I would say that too. Move your camera horizontally. As you advance, there are opportunities to modify that a little bit. As you move the camera, you could tow it in towards your subject, or you could actually orbit a camera around a subject. But for a beginner, I like the idea, translate it in a straight line. Distance between shots. Total shift across all frames is typically 1/30th of the distance to your subject. That's true in stereo photography where you're doing 2 pictures. It's not right for lenticular where you actually need a frame series, and not only do you need 2, you need more than 2, and you need a wider parallax. So not a good idea for lenticular. Number of shots for 3D depth, 5 to 12 frames is typical. Well, probably not exactly right. Usually people will divide the PPI of their printer by the LPI of their lens to get a starting point, and that's usually a value much higher than 5. Practical methods. Tripod on a rail slider. Probably that should be a rail slider on top of the tripod. Nodal slide, helpful for more control. Freehand. Workable for testing, but hard to keep level and consistent. That's true, although I know one lenticular artist who does a lot of freehand work, and he's a professional. Camera settings, lock your exposure, good idea. Lock your focus, good idea. Use fixed focal length or lock your zoom, good idea. Keep ISO, aperture, shutter speed identical across all frames, also a good idea. Subject consideration, static subjects were best, true. Foreground, background separation exaggerates the 3D effect nicely. Avoid subjects that are entirely flat, like a painting on a wall, won't read as 3D. Duh. Horizontal depth reads better than vertical in lenticular. That makes no sense at all. Horizontal versus vertical depth. Okay. Shoot it from left to right or right to left, just be consistent. That's true. Once you have your frames, you bring them into lenticular interlacing software like ArcSoft, Photoshop with a template, or dedicated tools like LensFlare Studio to create the final print. I'll have to see if ArcSoft does anything with lenticular. Photoshop with a template I would not recommend. And dedicated tools like LensFlare Studio. I'll have to look that up, but I have no... Just the title of that software program makes me think that is bad information. How about something like 3D Master Kit or Lentigram or Grape? Anyway, some good information, some bad information. Let's ask another one. What causes ghosting in a lenticular print, and how can I eliminate it? Let's see what it has to say about that. Ghosting is the most common lenticular problem. Ghosting is a problem with flips. It's not really a problem with 3D lenticulars. All right. Root causes. Misalignment between print and lens sheet, the most common cause. Yeah, well, sort of. Yes, your lens should always be aligned to your sheet. Print resolution too low. If your stripes aren't sharp edge, they bleed into neighbors optically. Yeah, technically true. Lens pitch miscalculated. Yeah, I suppose that that would cause some kind of banding or irregularities. I guess I'm going to assume that people are using, the correct pitch for their lens. Subject motion between frames, moving elements creates a double image like ghosting, but it's actually content misregistration. So that, yes, that would be sort of true. It's not really the type of ghosting we're talking about. Ink spread dot gain. Yes, I could see where dot gain could cause some ghosting because you require accuracy in lenticular printing. And quite frankly, the inkjet printers we use, they're adequate, they're good, they're not excellent. They can't really lay down the pixels as precisely as we'd like and as fine as we'd like. Lens sheet bonded or placed crooked, even a fraction of a degree throws off the alignment. Yeah, you don't want your lens crooked. You don't want a lot of these errors, but the point is if you've printed an interlaced file and you have your lens registered and it's still ghosting, what's the cause of that? Usually it's a cause due to contrast between the two pictures, a black against a white, high contrast imagery from one frame to the next. That's the biggest cause, and that's not really even mentioned. So quick diagnosis, ghost across entire print, pitch mismatch, wrong LPI. These are all wrong. It didn't really tell us how to solve it, did it? Getting a calibration print right before committing to a full run saves a lot of waste. That's true. It doesn't have anything to do with the question. Would you like tips on building a calibration target? No. All right. So it didn't describe the biggest cause of ghosting, and it really didn't describe a fix for it. So a related question, what causes banding in a lenticular print, and how can we fix that? By the way, there are good solutions, technical solutions to solving ghosting, and I'll be making some videos about that in the future. Banding shows up as visible horizontal or vertical stripes across the print. Well, they're typically in parallel to your lenticular sheet. So I suppose if you're doing vertical lenticules, then the banding would be vertical, and if you're doing horizontal lenticules, then the banding would be horizontal. But That's kind of a crazy little answer. All right, printing band, horizontal stripes. Most common type caused by printer hardware itself, not the lenticular setup. Causes, clogged or partially blocked inkjet nozzles, inconsistent ink flow or pressure, print head misalignment, bidirectional printing misregistration, head lays ink differently on left versus right pass. Of those four, possibly the last one could have some contribution to banding. I mean, I'm just assuming people don't have blocked inkjet nozzles. Usually it's a rounding error. It's a mathematical rounding error. You're taking something like 720 and dividing it by a non-integer, and at some point, the computer can't do that and has to step and make a new print. So fixes, well, since these causes aren't the problem, the fixes aren't the solution. Let's see. Optical banding vertical stripes. Interlace pitch doesn't match lens pitch exactly, causing more array-like beat pattern. That is true. Lens sheet has inconsistent pitch across its width. We'll assume that's not our case. Striped in the interlace file at the wrong width. We'll assume that's not our case. So how do you fix it? Remeasure your actual lens pitch and re-interlace with the corrected value. That's probably not a problem. Print a pitch calibration strip and find the exact match empirically, blah, 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 blah. Usually what most people do if there's banding is they just rotate their print before printing it out. It's not a perfect solution, but it generally gets rid of most of it. So, resolution mismatch banding. This really is the cause. Happens when print DPI and interlace frequency don't evenly divide. Interlace software assigns a non-integer number of pixels per stripe. Fixes, make sure DPI is an exact multiple of your stripe frequency. That would be an ideal world. Like you had 600 PPI printer and you had a lens sheet like 50 that divides evenly into that. But the problem is often you do a pitch test and the result is 50.125 or some non-integer, and that's what causes the banding. So it's identified really the reason for banding, but really hasn't come up with a good solution for it. So again, the commonly used solution, rotate your interlace file on the printer and print that out. Media feed banding, you hope you don't have that. Best practices to prevent banding. Always do a test print on the same lens material before a full run. Really nothing to do with banding. Never let, and I suppose it would identify that you have banding. Never let any software in the print pipeline resample or rescale your file. That's reasonable advice for lenticular. Print at native printer DPI. Don't let the driver interpolate. This is true, not, and I suppose that's right. If you interlaced a file to, let's say, 360 pixels per inch and your Canon printer wanted a multiple of 600, then some interpolation would occur. So you probably, for Epson, should be using 720 PPI and outputting your interlace file at that resolution, and for Canon or HP, you should output it at 600. And if you're doing anything that's not a multiple of those two, you probably will cause banding. Use fresh ink and let the printer warm up before critical prints. What? Really doesn't have anything to do with our issue. Anyway, so now we have asked AI some lenticular questions, and we've seen that sometimes it gives a good answer and sometimes it gives the wrong answer, and that's just the way it is. But if you follow this YouTube channel or the Lenticular Art Printing and 3D Photography Facebook group or my Patreon page, you can always find out answers to questions like these based on years of experience. That's all. I'm Michael Brown. Hope you enjoyed this little experiment. I did. See you next time. Bye.